Hey guys, Mr. O'Brien here, and in this lesson, we're going to be looking at organisms and their relationships. So, in ecology, organisms interacting with one another is a really important and a really important thing to study because it shows how all organisms are kind of interconnected within an ecosystem. So, for our focus question today, we are going to be looking at what relationships among organisms might exist with a bird nest built in a thorny tree. So, with ecology, scientists have determined that each organism, regardless of where it lives, depends on non living factors found in its environment and on other organisms living in the same environment for survival. So, with ecology, all living things need both non living and living things in order to survive. So, when we're talking about non living things, this is what we were referring to as an abiotic factor. Okay, so an abiotic factor just means that it is non living. Okay, now a living thing is a biotic factor. So when we are looking at abiotic and biotic factors, these are referring to things that are characteristics in an ecosystem that are either abiotic, non-living, or biotic, which is living. So ecology is the scientific discipline in which the relationship among living organisms and their interactions that organisms have with their environment are studied. So in other words, an ecologist is looking at an ecosystem or one particular area on planet Earth and determining what are all the relationships that these organisms or this ecosystem has that allows that to survive. Now, somebody who is studying ecology, we call them an ecologist. So ecologists are not only looking at living things, but also looking at the non-living things that make that organism survive in that habitat. So for example, if you have the ecologist down here, he is looking at the seals in the Arctic ice. Now, ecologists work in the field a lot of the time, as well as in the laboratory setting. So the ecologist has to endure very harsh conditions in order to study the seal and see what is allowing them, what are they eating, where are they breeding, where are they interacting with one another. So being able to be in the field is really, really important. So we have a couple milestones in ecology we want to talk about. The first one occurred all the way back in 1905, and this was done by President Theodore Roosevelt. Now, during this time in the modern environmental movement, Theodore Roosevelt wanted to set aside these tracts of land to be enjoyed by everybody. He was a really big conservationist, and he wanted individuals to have the rights of hunting and fishing for not only his generations, but generations to come. So he set aside over 70 million hectares of land to protect the natural resources found in them, whether it was natural beauty or the animals that were found in this location. In 1962, a novelist called Rachel Carson published a best-selling book called Silent Spring. And in Silent Spring, what she did was she was warning of the environmental dangers of pollution and pesticides. In other words, she believed that with our broad use of pesticides in the United States, we were at one point going to see a spring that was completely silent. And this was due to all the songbirds dying off from it. In 1967, the government of Rwanda and an international conservation group began efforts to protect the mountain gorillas. Now, the mountain gorillas were exposed to a large amount of poaching. And due to these cultures believe that the mountain gorillas had some sort of medicinal purpose. And this was due in large part to the work of Diana Fossey. And she, with her work with the Rwanda government, kind of protected these mountain gorillas for the long run from these poachers. In 1987, the United States and other countries signed the Montreal Protocol. Now, in the Montreal Protocol, this was an agreement to phase out the use of chemical compounds that destroyed the ozone layer. So a lot of hairsprays during that time used what were called CFCs, or chlorofluorocarbons, which broke down the ozone layer and led to the hole developing within it. In 1990, the Indigenous Environmental Network, or the IEN, directed by Tom Goldtooth, is formed by Native Americans to protect their tribal lands and communities from environmental dangers. In 2004, um, Wangra Matha, wins a Nobel Prize, and she began the Green Belt movement of Africa. And what she did is she hired women to plant trees to slow the process of deforestation and desertification. So, in other words, all the trees were completely removed and the climate was being completely destroyed. In 2015, the island fox found in California Channel Islands, which was nearly extinct, makes a comeback due to the success of conservation efforts. Now, because all organisms in an ecosystem are connected, either directly or indirectly, understanding relationships can be extremely challenging. And this is why they rely on models. Now, when we're talking about a scientific model are a way of creating a visual representation to answer a question or test a hypothesis. So in this case, we are looking at this model right here, which takes a look at two organisms that are very close related. The snowshoe hare, which is more like a rabbit type organism, and the Canadian lynx, which hunts the rabbit. And what you'll notice is, if we take a look at the blue line, which is the hare, as the hare population increases, shortly afterwards, the red line, which is the lynx population, the lynx increases with it. Now, once the lynx eats a whole bunch of the rabbits, you'll notice that the rabbit population crashes and the lynx population crashes it with it. You can see this up and down pattern kind of goes hand in hand with one another, and we use models in order to. All right, so when we're looking at models are really important that allow scientists to simulate a process or a system. So in this case, we're simulating the snowshoe and the hare or the lynx population, and we're looking at how when one population goes up, the other kind of goes along with it, and then when it crashes, the other kind of crashes with it. So studying organisms in the field can be very difficult because there are often too many variables to study at one time. And remember, a controlled experiment must only be testing one variable. So to counteract this, models allow ecologists to control the number of variables present and to slowly introduce new variables to fully understand the effect of each variable. So these two things are kind of why models are really, really important when we're looking at ecology and how it's studied. So when we're studying ecology, we're doing so on the biosphere. The biosphere is the portion of Earth that supports life. So the term bio means life, and sphere is just this geometric shape that looks like a ball. So because ecologists study organisms and their environment, their studies take place in the biosphere. So when you're looking at planet Earth, this is our biosphere. Now, the biosphere includes only the portions of Earth that include life. So the biosphere is a thin layer around the Earth that extends several kilometers above the Earth's surface into the atmosphere and several kilometers below the ocean surface. So living things can live in a very wide range of ecosystems. So the diversity of the biospheres, or the biosphere's diverse location contain organisms that can survive in really unique conditions. Organisms can survive anywhere from a tropical rainforest, which would be, kind of see here, we have our rainforest. They can survive in a desert, which is an extremely dry condition, or at the bottom of the ocean. Now, these aquatic worms down here, they live at the bottom of the Mariana Trench. And where they survive is they do not use sunlight as a source of energy. They use the sulfur that is vented out from volcanic vents. And these organisms live around these locations. Anywhere else, they're unable to live. So ecologists study these organisms, their adaptations, like the sea worms, and factors in their environment. So let's look at the biotic factors that allow organisms to survive in an ecosystem. Now, a biotic factor is the living factors in an organism's environment. Now, if an organism lives in water, this could be things like fish, algae, frogs, even microscopic bacteria organisms that live inside the water. Organisms that live on land or adjacent to land, this could be like migratory animals, or um, it could be like the leaves, the trees, the organisms in the dirt. All right, all of these things would be biotic factors if they are living. So, if we take a look here, the interactions among organisms are necessary for the health of all species in the same geographic location. Let's explain how organisms are dependent on other organisms. So, if we take a look here and we take a look at, let's just say, the deer that we saw in the previous pictures, okay? What are some living things that allow this deer to survive? So, for example, the deer has to eat grass. That's a living thing. The trees in the forest provide protection. There could also be predators that affect that organism as well. So all of these things are living or biotic factors that that organism is dependent on. Now, abiotic factors or non-living factors in an organism's environment are things like temperature, air or water currents, sunlight, soil, rainfall, or available nutrients. Now, organisms are dependent on these things just like they are dependent in the natural world. So, if we take a look here, right, and we're taking a look at our environment, we always have to take into account both the living and non living factors that we're experiencing. So, organisms are adapted to survive in not only biotic but abiotic factors that are present in the natural environment. So, if an organism moves to another location, like for say the swamp located here in Georgia, they are more dependent on the rainfall than they are as the desert animal right here, which is not so dependent on the rainfall in that current location. Okay, so compare and contrast abiotic and biotic factors that are shown in the photo at the beginning of this module. So if we take a look here, right, and we're looking at biotic factors. So what are some biotic factors that we have in this picture? Now, things we can see are the trees or the plants that are located in this general area. Okay, these are living biotic factors. We can also talk about the bacteria that breaks down the leaves, or the bacteria that's found in the water. Okay, these are living biotic factors. Now, just from looking at this habitat, we might have organisms like deer, bear, maybe we have squirrels. Okay, all of these are biotic factors. Now, the abiotic factors in this environment, okay, are just as important. Things like the climate, things like the temperature of the air. Maybe we even have the amount of rainfall. So, as we can see, the biotic or living factors are just as important as the abiotic factors in this environment. So this kind of leads us to some jobs that you may see in the scientific field. So jobs, maybe the conservation scientist. Do you care about preserving and protecting national and state parks and other natural areas? Conservation scientists are responsible for managing the overall land quality of forests, parks, as well as rangelands and other natural resources. They oversee foresting and conservation activities on public parklands, and they also may work with private landowners of organization. So this is really, really important when we're looking at our national park system, our state parks, our national forests. How are we going to manage this resource in order to sustain it for a long period of time? Some of you, this might really interest you. I really am a big component of conservation science. factors of that would be like other plants, other animals, predators. These are living things that affect the overall health. All right. So if we take a look, and for any environmental factor, there is an upper limit and a lower limit that define the conditions in which an organism survives. So the tolerance range is the range at which an organism can survive in a particular area. So where the population is the highest, we call that the optimal range. So the optimal range is where the organism, just like in this picture, is at its highest. There are a large number of individuals and the population is very stable. Now, as we start to get out of this optimal range into the lower and upper limit of it, this is called the zone of physiological stress. The zone of physiological stress is the area where the weak, the old, they start to die off and the population begins to decline. Now, once it begins to decline too much, where that limiting factor is either too high or too low, and the population completely dies out, that is called the zone of intolerance. Okay, so zone of intolerance is where the populations die off. The individual is no longer able to survive. It's outside of its tolerance range. The zone of physiological stress is where the populations decline, and the optimal range is where it's at its highest. So let's take a look and let's infer which other abiotic factors might limit the survival of steelhead trout. Make a list of anything that you think would affect the overall population. So and take 2 minutes, pause the video, see if you can do this on your own. So if we take a look, trout are really dependent, right here. Trout are really dependent on their abiotic factors. So if we take a look, oxygen in the water is a big one. If we don't have enough oxygen, that organism is not going to be able to breathe and move at a efficient enough pace. The temperature of the water. If temperature gets too high or too low, the organism is not going to be able to survive. Water quality. If the water is not clean, it is polluted, that organism is not going to be able to survive in the long run here. Okay, so these are three big ones. Maybe another one that you can kind of look at here, water quality. Maybe you can also look at the climate as a whole, right? So if you get a huge storm, this could really affect the individuals with the amount of water rushing through. So the ability of an organism to survive when subject to abiotic factors or biotic factors is called their tolerance. So steelhead trout have a specific range of temperature tolerance that they can survive in. So we talked about these a little before. So the greatest number of an individual live in the optimal range. The zone of physiological stress is where the abiotic factor is either too high or too low, causing the old, the sick, and the weak to die off. So let's take a look here at our graph, and I'm going to start with our optimal range in blue, okay? So our optimal range would be the areas where the population is the highest. So here, where our steelhead trout are growing, that is where our optimal range is. Moving along to our zone of physiological stress, there are two zones of zone of physiological stress where the critical factor or the tolerance range is too high or too low, or the tolerance range is too high. This is where the population is beginning to die off. The old, the sick, the weak, they are no longer functioning in that community. And then finally, we have the zone of intolerance. This is where the population can no longer survive and the population of the organism has completely died off. So again, the range of tolerance goes from the zone of physiological stress through the optimal range to the zone of physiological stress. So water temperature is a limiting factor for steelhead when water temperature is outside the range of tolerance. The limiting factor is anything that constrains a population's size and slows or stops it from growing. Okay, so limiting factors are, again, when the population is not growing, not getting any bigger, it is the limiting factors are high enough on it to prevent the population from growing. So that brings us to our levels of organization. So the biosphere is too large and complex for most ecologists to study it efficiently. So the study of relationships within the biosphere, ecologists look at a different level of organization or small pieces of the biosphere. The levels increase in the complexity as the numbers and interactions between the organisms increases. So let's take a look at our levels of organization here. So when we're looking at our levels of organization in ecology, the smallest one we have is an organism, like our individual water buffalo here, okay? So it is a single organism. So an organism is the lowest level of organization and is any living biological entity. So as we move up, when we have a whole bunch of these individuals together, we call that a population. Individual organisms of a single species that share the same geographic location at the same time make up a population. So how many of these water buffalo we have, that's what we're referring to. As we move up even further, we enter into a biological community. Now, this is a group of interacting populations that occupy the same geographic area at the same time. So again, in a biological community, we are looking at all of the living things. And remember, all the living things would be all of the biotic factors that we have in that particular area. So moving up even further, where we're looking at both the living and non-living, or the biotic and abiotic factors, this ecosystem is a biological community and all the abiotic factors that affect it. Okay, moving up even further, we move into a biome, which is a large group of ecosystems that share the same climate and have the same type of community. So for example, a tropical rainforest would be an example of a biome. Okay, and then finally, we have all the biomes on Earth combining together to form our biosphere. So let's take a look at this a little bit further. All right, so our biosphere is the highest level of organization, and it is pretty much planet Earth. That moves down into one particular biome, which in this case would be a coral reef. In that biome, it is made up of an ecosystem, which is the biological community, as well as all of the other abiotic factors that live there. The biological community just looks at all the population species, all of the living species that we have in this particular ecosystem. Then we look at one particular population of some sort of group of individuals, whether it be a fish or a coral. And then finally, we go to the individual organism, which in this case is our striped bass. So ecosystems, interactions, and interactions between organisms are really important when we are looking at the overall ecosystem. So if we are looking at this, a community of organisms increases the chances for survival of any one species by using the available resources in different ways. So in other words, all of these organisms have the same resources. So how they use those resources is really important. So if you take a look, all of these birds use the same tree. The trees shown in the image are the habitat, or an area where the organism lives. So organisms not only have a habitat, but they have a niche as well. And a niche is the role that that organism or position that organism has in the environment. as an organism or as the organism's niche is how it meets its needs in the ecosystem. This could be food, shelter, reproduction, or living space, temperature, moisture. All of these things could be its niche. So, how organisms interact and how they live together in a biological community is constantly interact. These interactions, along with the abiotic factors, shape an ecosystem. So we're going to start with competition. All organisms must compete in order for that organism to survive. And when more than one organism uses a resource at the same time, that's what we refer to as competition. The strong organisms directly compete with the weak organisms for survival, and usually the strong survive and the weak die. So within this competition, we often see predation, right? Many species get their food by eating other organisms, and they eat these organisms in a process called predation, or the act of one organism pursuing and consuming another organism for food. Now, the organism that is pursuing the other organism is the predator. So in this case, we have our lion, which is the predator. And the prey is the organism that is pursued. So in this case, we have the buffalo, which is the prey. Same thing over here. Our predator is our rattlesnake, and our prey is our mouse. Okay, you can kind of see predator is doing the eating, the prey is getting eaten. So we have a couple different types of beneficial predators in insects, right? We have our ladybug, which is the predator, which is eating these little organisms called aphids. Aphids destroy crops, so ladybugs are really important in actually controlling this pest. The other one would be a praying mantis, like you see over on the right side of the screen, okay? The praying mantis is eating grasshoppers, which control the population of grasshoppers and prevent them from destroying crops. We also have plant predators like our Venus flytrap, okay? In the Venus flytrap, you can see they are eating and consuming the wasp that is present on it, okay? So we have animals as well as plant predators. So let's look at our different types of interactions here. So the close relationship that exists when two or more species live together is called symbiosis. Symbiosis is just referring to the close interaction between these two organisms. And we have three different types of symbiosis. We have, hold on, let me change my pointer here. We have mutualism, we have commensalism, and we have parasitism. Now, one of the big symbiotic relationships that we see is the clownfish and the sea anemone, right? The clownfish lives in the stinging sea anemone for protection, and the clownfish fertilizes as well as kind of like live bait that is used in order for the organism to survive. So our first type we want to look at here is mutualism. And mutualism is the relationship between two or more organisms that live closely together and benefit from each one. So if we take a look here, the example we have here is the sloth. So the sloth, how it is benefited is it has algae growing on its fur. So the sloth's benefit is having added insulation to keep the organism warm, and the algae gets a place to live. So both of these organisms are interacting, and both of them are surviving from this close relationship. Now, another example would be lichens. So lichens is another mutualistic relationship between fungi and algae. Algae provides the food for the fungus, and the fungi provides a habitat for the algae. The close association of these two organisms provides two basic needs for this particular organism. So the next one we have is commensalism. Commensalism is the relationship in which one organism benefits and the other is neither helped or harmed. So in this case, one organism benefits, the other one, there is no interaction or no kind of plus or balance for it. So the clownfish finds food and protection by living in the sea anemone, and the sea anemone is not harmed and doesn't receive any benefit from the relationship with the clownfish. But the clownfish does gain a whole lot of benefit from it. So commensalism, one benefits. In this case, the clownfish benefits, and the anemone has no impact. So the next one we have is parasitism. Now, a symbiotic relationship in which one organism benefits at the expense of another. So one benefits, the parasite, the other one, the host, is negatively affected. Now, a lot of times the parasite doesn't want to kill the host, instead only harming or weakening it, because death of the host would also mean the death of the parasite. So the longer the parasite keeps it alive, the longer, or keeps the host alive, the longer they will stay alive. So an example of a parasite that's not what you would think is actually a cowbird. And the brown-headed cowbird actually lays its eggs in another bird's nest, and then abandons the eggs altogether. The host bird incubates and feeds the young cowbirds. And if you notice, what the cowbirds do is they hatch first, and they will actually push the eggs out of the nest. Often the baby cowbird pushes the host eggs or young eggs from the nest. Okay, so that's an example of a parasitic bird. So if we take a look here, ecologist is the branch of biology that focuses on interrelationships between organisms and their environments. Abiotic and biotic limiting factors restrict the growth of populations within. The limiting factors keep the population down. Organisms have a range of tolerance for each limiting factor that they encounter. And levels of organization in ecology, ecological studies include organism, population, biological community, ecosystem, biome, and biosphere. And finally, symbiotic relationships such as commensalism, parasitism, and mutualism exist when more species are interacting. So if we remember, commensalism is when one benefits and the other one is not affected. Parasitism is where one benefits and the other one is negatively affected. And mutualism is when both are benefiting from the interaction. So hopefully this video helps you out with lesson 1 of our module 2 ecology chapter. If you have any questions, just let me know. This is Mr. O'Brien signing off.